Hi, Misha here, and a pistol that has really gained a lot of attention recently because of news from Springfield and FN USA is the good old Browning High Power, or P35, or GP, or many other names, including L9A1 for the British. This is because of manufacturing news like the SA35 and the reintroduction of the updated model from FN coming out this year. And I was hoping to get out and shoot one of mine, but we've had a very stormy spring here, and of course it rained and lightninged all day Sunday, so was not able to go shooting. I apologize. What can you do? But let's still talk about it and kind of see, is this still a modern, viable gun? Why are people interested? What's a little bit of the history? What's some of the mechanics? How has the high power really influenced firearms going forward? I mean, this was Browning's really last manufactured concept, so it's a fitting tribute to him that it's been so very successful. Well, here are mine. Nothing really new. But hey, who doesn't like to take their high powers out? And I've actually got holsters for all these for once. Over here we've got my Canadian Inglis #1 Mark 1, and it's shoulder stock, perfectly legal, grandfathered in gun. Here we have the one I showed you last year when I picked it up. This is a FN production from 1943 or 44. But under Nazi occupation and authority with the Waffen-Amp markings, and its leather holster and spare magazine. We have its kind of concurrent gun. This is my English #2 Mark 1, British military issue. Actually, it's my oldest one, come to think of it. And we have my Argentinian FMAP high power in a modern reproduction holster with a crazy long mag that a friend gave me. But yeah, I had the holster. Why not? It's appropriate. These have all seen use. They're all surplus, and I all love them a great deal. But why is that, and why do so many others? If I'm being honest with you, I actually find the high power more interesting than the 1911. I know, gasp. But hey, does it really surprise you? So with that, I promise not to go too deep into the history. I just want to put some things into context and talk about some of the mechanics of this gun. And before we do that, just because I've got a clip from some old range shooting, let's throw that up just to show you that I do actually shoot these. At least in the past when I had time and the weather cooperated. So we'll do that, and then we'll just get into it. If you could do comment, those always help, like, sharing, and subscribing. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to the Patreon page. So, let's dive in. High power. And be held open. My Canadian #1 Mark 1 is the best example I have of a pre-war high power P35, because at that time they were pretty much all slotted for a stock and had the tangent adjustable rear sides. That was just kind of a thing in the 1920s and 30s. Of course, World War II would get rid of it. And this design would evolve over 20 years. And of course, it started off, as you know, with John Moses Browning around 1914, so just prior to World War I. He had just successfully sold this design, the model 1911, to Colt, firing, of course, 45, single action only, hammer fired, you know the gun. And so he was thinking about what to do next. And actually this gun here, the Savage, this is the model 1907 in 32, also French World War I issue. But this was the main competitor to the 1911, or rather the scaled-up version. And it had an interesting and quite unique feature for that day and time. Guns like the Colt here have a single stack magazine, so most guns had 7 or 8 rounds full size, sometimes 9. The little Savage here, even though it is quite small, it had, if I can get it out single-handed, I'm going to sit you down for a second. It's not really meant for that. See, it comes out really good in the hand. It was one of the earliest concepts for a double stack single feed style. Notice the feed's kind of centered in the top. This allowed it to have 10 rounds, even though it is quite compact. Browning was intrigued by this, so he started working on some prototypes with his own double stack magazine concept. And since Colt owned the patent to the firing system for the 1911, he went back to the striker firing system for one of his prototypes, similar to like he used in the 1900, 1910. He also toyed around with a prototype that was basically a direct blowback with a really heavy spring. Think like Astra 1921 400. And these early guns were quite large, and they had a 16-round magazine. Pretty impressive for this era. And he would file a patent for it in 1923, but unfortunately it would not be granted until shortly after his death in 1927. And that's where Yudenov Saiv comes in. I kind of think of him as Browning's understudy or student at FN, and he further refines the design to what we know today. By the late 20s, the patents on the 1911 were over, so he was able to incorporate some features like the hammer, and even though it uses a similar lockup system, barrel system, he did improve it and simplify it, going to the linkless design we know and love. And most importantly, he continued on with the magazine concept, typically reducing it from 16 rounds to 13, but still very good size for that day and time. And as you can see, it's a much more evolved design versus what the Savage had, especially with the feed and the follower. And of course, since I've worked at FN, they would get first stab at this weapon. And by this point, 9mm Parabellum, aka 9x19 Luger, was kind of the standard throughout Europe. The US was one of the few that were hanging on to 45. This was still just a single action design. Double action would actually have to wait till Walther's P38. So basically, the two big elements were the simplified Browning tipping barrel system without a link, and more importantly, this double stack magazine pattern, which frankly we still use to this very day. So that's the beginning. The next element were the French trials for their new service pistol. During the Great War, France had a ton of different guns. They used the old revolvers, they had quite a few 32s, and in the 1920s they had a lot of military programs, but funding was low and urgency was low. But after a certain person came to power in Germany, things did start to speed up. So in 1935, there were trials to select their next service gun. And FN, along with Saiv and his new design, thought they had a pretty good shot at it. They'd already had success marketing it to the Belgian army, who would very soon adopt it. And so it only took a little bit of reworking to kind of meet the French requirements. For example, the new pistol needed to be 1 kilogram or less, so 2.2 pounds or less. It needed to be compact and handy. This is a little under 8 inches long with a barrel that's about 4 3/4, compact for the day and time. It needed to have a magazine of at least 10 rounds because, again, the French had the Savage in the First World War, so they like the high capacity. It needed to have a manual hammer, which is one of the reasons, amongst others, Sive would integrate this into the design. These trials took years to form, and people knew what was coming. It also needed to have a manual safety, and it needed to have a magazine disconnect safety. So, yeah, we have the French to thank for the fact that original high powers, you can't fire with the magazine out. The downside to this, even though it is a safety feature, doesn't make the trigger fantastic. But again, this was a very common thing for the 1930s. Think of the Japanese Nambu getting it. It's just part of the time. It also needed to be lethal to at least 50 meters and able to punch through something like a helmet. And 9x19 would do the trick. So the pistol was one of the most advanced in the world, and as we know, of course, it's one of the most successful designs post-war. So you would think the French would jump all over it. They did not. These are the two guns that really excel in the trials. This one being adopted, the Sachem Emily 1935A, with the Emily 1935S kind of coming in second. And in some ways, these do meet the requirements. They are compact and relatively light. They do have a manual safety, although it would be added on some. It's a very simplistic safety that physically just blocks the hammer. And they fire 7.65 long, which, yeah, it's basically a souped-up 32. I guess it can do the job, but not exactly the most powerful. They're, of course, both single action, and they do not have 10-round magazines. They're actually 8. It was a case of these were designed in France, and they were going to go with the French design. They had their reasons, but yeah. It was also thanks to France that FN had its now famous paint over phosphate type coating, originally developed for the French Navy. The Japanese Navy also used a somewhat similar coating, paint over blooming. So, the P-35 did not become France's new Grand Power pistol, GP, although the name would sometimes be applied to it. But others would adopt it. Finland would purchase about 2,500 during the Winter War and right after, using them for decades. And FN would have built about 35,000 by the time World War II started in September 1939. So you can definitely see some inspiration in how it came to be there. But let's move into the war. Here the number 1 Mark I is with its shoulder stock, perfectly legal. These are grandfathered in. And here is my wartime Nazi German production model, my most recent pickup from about a year ago. World War II proved France wrong. The high power already had success, but then the Germans came. They would invade at the beginning of May 1940, and by the end of the month, Belgium, along with the FN factory, would fall. But Germany needed all the arms they could have, and the FN factory was originally set up decades earlier to make Mausers, so yeah, DWM was charged with getting them back up and running, and by the end of 1940, they had built about 8,500 pistols for the Germans. This would be ramped up to 65 the next year, 80 the following year, and really over 100,000 in 1943, back down to about 65,000 in 1944, and then the factory was finally liberated from the Nazis in September of that year. The first ones were marked with the inspector code of 613, and they would have stock slots, adjustable sights, pretty much be built from pre-war parts. After that, the mark would go to 103, and you would still see adjustable sights, but some shortcuts and some new parts started to be made. By 1942, moving into 43, you really do start to see a lot of economies like this simplistic military-grade bluing, simple wood grips, the stock slots now gone, adjustable sights are now gone, and these are marked with 140. And they're typically just issued with a flat holster and a spare 13-round 9mm mag. It was a great fit for Germany because, yeah, this is their standard cartridge, and they appreciated its high capacity and reliability, durability, simplicity. That's one thing the French also wanted when they were doing their trials, was easy to disassemble. And these are just push out a pin, and there you go. No bushing in the front like on the 1911. Everything is simplified in a good way on this design. Sive did a good job. And while this was never standard issue within Nazi Germany, it was used extensively by the paratroopers, the Waffen-SS, and a few others, including police. And they would have about 300,000. So it was used very much on the Axis side during the war, quite famously. I'm putting a link in the description to a more detailed account of these Nazi guns, but just know that even towards the end, they were still of quite good quality. Like this one, the trigger's a little rougher, everything's a little bit, less refined as you would expect for wartime production, especially from an occupied factory, but still a very nice, smooth gun. Still has the magazine disconnect safety, because that's just part of the design. Thank you, France. But it's a little bit rougher, and of course the rattling is just a military gun. Perfectly fine trigger, perfectly adequate fixed sights. And of course that's only half of the story. The story of how Canada, the John Inglis factory of all factories, would end up producing quite a large number of high powers is very intriguing. In that video I just mentioned, I go into detail, and I've done it in the past, so I won't go too much here. But it also does relate to the Nazi invasion of Belgium. When the Nazis came in, the director of FN happened to be in the UK, along with some of his staff and subordinates. Unfortunately, Sive was not. He was still in Europe, but he would escape the following year and eventually make his way to the UK. So the team was basically there along with a lot of other Belgians in exile. Now the Chinese, the nationalist Chinese, the Republicans, they were wanting to buy high powers with shoulder stocks from FN, but before this could happen, the invasion. So long story short, they requested that John English to make these, and they gave it a whirl. But they'd never made a pistol before, much less the high power, which is pretty advanced for its day and time. So it took time. It wasn't until 1943 work really progressed. The Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield made a couple of test prototypes. They had a few pre-war examples to study, and again they had Sive and a few other engineers, and they had the powers that be at FN. So towards the end of the year, the Chinese ordered 180,000 so-called number 1 Mark 1s with shoulder stocks, and these were to be made in Canada, and they were ramping up. There was a little bit of argument over royalties for a minute, but eventually, yeah, they were going to be paid, and so Inglis was to make no more than 250,000 pistols, giving FN like 25 cents per pistol, and they would get all the support they needed from Sive and others there. The first pistols were shipped to China at the beginning of 1944, and of course things get complicated because they're fighting the Japanese, but they're also fighting themselves with the communists. To cut it short, very few pistols get delivered this year, and things are canceled and redirected, and by this time both the Canadian Army and the British are interested in the gun, so they place orders. So initially about 15,000 of the number 1 Mark 1s were redirected towards the UK and Canada, and they liked them. They found that for special operations and for the paratroopers, kind of like how Germany found, they were a great gun. Reliable, simple, everything you come to expect from a Browning and Sive design. It was just a great design team. The only thing they really didn't care for was the adjustable sights or the shoulder stock. By this point, mid-war, these features are seen to be less than advantageous. So, a new model was created. Here's my trusty old number 2 Mark I. This is the high power I've had the longest. And this one's been through the wars, but I like it. The number 2 Mark I was a simplification, much as the Nazis had done. Fixed rear sights and no stock slot. They also would introduce some improvements for reliability and ease of manufacturing. This would be the Mark I Star. And these were ordered in quite large numbers. Canada would order over 50,000. The UK would order over 35,000. And even though it took a number of years to really get production up and running, once it was going, these were delivered quite quickly. And there would be batches sent to China of the number 1s periodically, but the number 2 was pretty much for Canada and the UK. A few others would go to places like South Africa too. Now the reason that both Canada and the UK really could use this gun is they were using revolvers as their standard gun. And this never was standard during the war, but it was used by a number of entities. Fewer than 44,000 would ultimately be delivered to the Chinese because the communists were taking over, yada yada, war was ending. The last English pistols would come off the line in September of 1945, so about a year after the FN factory was liberated, and there was no need to extend it because FN themselves could start building them again in Belgium. It was a wartime expediency, but they would build quite a large number, about 152,000. About 60,000 were of the number 1 pattern, and about 92,000 were of the number 2 pattern. And you'll see tens of thousands in Canadian and British use for decades to come. In fact, it was pretty much their first pistol, and a good start for it. Yeah, these are super neat. Kind of a generic NATO flap holster. It does have a spot in here for a cleaning rod and a spare magazine way down in here. This is the holster this came with too. And of course this is the holster stock for the number 1. These are made in Canada as well. World War II proved the high power was a great design, and that the 9mm cartridge was valid. But a lot of guns did not make it out past the war. Newer designs came along, wartime budgets were cut, so it was the death knell, or at least the big slowdown for a lot of guns. Not for the high power, not even close. In fact, its heyday, it's just getting started, guys. So post-war, it wouldn't take long for FN to put the high power back into production. The stock slot almost always disappeared, and typically you had fixed sights, although sometimes you would have adjustables, especially on sport type guns. I've seen a few too that were police that had the adjustable. In the USA, they first appear in 1954 under the Browning Arms Company name, and they switch from high power, H-I-G-H, to high power, capital H, capital I power, just to denote a few things and what have you. Why not? Marketing, it's a good thing. And they started to be known as the Mark I. They looked a lot like this, although often for the commercial market and police, they had several grades of blued finish and then later nickel finishes and all kinds of good stuff, two-tones. Grips could be wood or Bakelite or later rubber, of course later on polymer. FN was happy to please their customers, just as we see with their FALs and other guns, though give you a full catalog and let you customize. And in Britain, they would continue to use the number 2 Mark 1. In fact, it would start to become officially adopted in 1954 as well, and for a while they would use the, roughly 70, 80,000 total they had, including number 1s. But when they needed more, as the revolvers were all fully retired in the late 50s, they would start buying Mark 1s from FN in Belgium around 1960, and these would be marked L9A1, which I would love to have one. They're actually marked on the slide. They're just a standard one. By the way, this does have the Sunkerite finish, which was the British fancy black paint they like to use. It's neat. While I'd love to have an L9A1, I am happy to at least have this gun that was very clearly in British service. And the English guns would serve alongside the post-war FN guns all the way up through the 80s when they finally were kind of retired out. And of course, the newer purchased Belgian guns would not only continue in service in Britain, but they'd keep buying new ones, and they would somewhat update the design over time, as would FN. It was just a testament to what a good design it was. Interestingly, on this one, I don't know if the British did it or if a owner did, the disconnect safety is removed, and it does make the trigger noticeably nicer. So, yeah. Also, I always like the thumbprint on these to make disassembly easier. And some of the commercial guns with the high polished blue from this era are absolutely gorgeous and smooth as can be. Machined frame, machined slide, all that. But of course, as the 60s would come on, changes would need to be made to keep these current and to address some issues that had popped up over time. And to represent a later production, we have my Argentine gun. Now, Argentina would first buy some Mark 1s from Belgium around 1960, and then in 1968 they would negotiate manufacturing rights with FN. They were already making guns like the FAL, so it followed suit. Now, going back to 1962, we have a major improvement. We are going to an external extractor. These are more reliable, more durable, and overall just a good idea. And then just a couple of years later, we would go to an updated locking system with a 2-piece barrel. This would improve reliability and longevity for the frame and slide. Unfortunately, it also means that a lot of newer parts won't work with the older. And these combined features end up making what we refer to as the Type 65 or Model 65 of the Mark I. From there, in the early 70s, we would go from the ring hammer, like we saw here, commander style, to the spur hammer. This has some benefits. It's a lot easier to cock, a lot bigger. It also can lead to hammer bite for some people. Notice how low it hangs down versus the ring that really just doesn't. And if it does, it's a rounded edge versus a pointy edge. So that's a bit of a double-edged hammer. Oh well. What do you do? They would also change the bushing end of the slide here, making the barrel recessed a bit with this protective ring around it. Before, when we had these, the barrel protruded ever so slightly. This was done to protect the crown and also potentially improve reliability, and you can probably understand why. It's a good idea. So these changes, and a couple of other small ones, would end up creating the Type 73, or Model 73. And originally, FMAP, Rosario, Argentina, would make the 65, but around 1978, they would update their manufacturing practices to mirror the 73. Some of their guns would have lanyard rings, others would not. Some were blued, some were painted, some were phosphated. These were produced for military, police, and export. And actually, I think Arms Corps was the first importer of Argentinian high powers in the 1980s. And they would keep up with licensed production throughout the 80s. Finally, the contract would end in 1989, and the FN oversight would discontinue. Also, just for fun, here's an extended 20-round mag. 20? I don't know. A friend gave me a long time ago. Kind of neat. Same, just, longer. Really like my Argentine gun. They are just as nice quality as any other. Especially if you don't care about finish, if you're just talking about reliability. Of course, they have the disconnect safety too. And they are parts interchangeable because they are a licensed product. And so that gets us kind of to the end of the original high power, the Mark I, frankly. The classic gun. The one that frankly interests me the most, if I'm just being frank with you. But it didn't stop there, as you know. Currently, I don't have the later versions. In the early 80s, FN introduced the Mark II. Mainly, it was a version with an extended and ambidextrous safety. And to go with it, they went to kind of modern style nylon type synthetic grips that had kind of finger rests on both sides to be ambi grips. They also reworked the chamber and barrel a bit to try to let them take hollow points a bit better. Because, in World War II, this era, it was FMJ. Hollow points weren't really a thought of thing. I mean, they existed, but militaries and police weren't using them. By the 80s, with the changing world and body armor and other things and defensive rounds, so that was a kind of big update for the Mark II. The Mark III would come just under a decade later at the end of the 80s, and it would kind of continue the trend of making it a more commercially viable gun. They updated the finish to a black epoxy style, a little more modern type. They also added a firing pin block, kind of like on a Series 80 Colt. And a few other small changes. By the way, with the Mark IIs and 3s, we start to go to like 3-dot sights and more fancy sight options. But at their core, still basically the same gun. Heck, FN even released a double-action version, the Browning double-action, the BDA, and a double-action only version, the BDAO, but of course, a lot of parts weren't interchangeable. And production continued apace into the 90s. In fact, FN did not stop building the high power until 2018. And that kind of gets us back to the topic of this video in current times. We can debate which of these is the legitimate World War II high power. This one was made in the FN factory, but the Inglis were made with Syve's involvement and under license. It's just one of those fun things about World War II. In the Argentine version here, the reason I really like these, they were military and licensed guns as well. And of course, these two guns could have very well gone up against each other in the Falklands War in 1982. It really goes to show you just how popular the gun was. They built over 1.5 million officially by FN. And the number of nations that have used these, it's probably quicker to say the number of nations that did not. The U.S. issued some in Vietnam to SOG. The French ended up with some following the war because they kind of realized the error of their ways, and at least they had other guns available. You start to see a lot of use with the Israelis. They really like the Mark II and the Mark III. I had an Israeli Mark II pistol, I believe it was. It might have been a 3. But you see a lot of those surplus guns floating around. Of course, Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi used them. Yeah, everywhere. China used some. Very popular pistol. If the FAL was the right arm of the free world, this would be the right foot. I don't know. It was prevalent throughout NATO, the third world. It was unlicensedly produced in India. and it even made some inroads into the comp block. It would be one of the most mass-produced pistols outside of the comp block, like the Makarovs and all that. It has so much legacy and history. And there were a lot of unlicensed clones and copies because the patents were long over. For example, in Argentina, after their contract was over, they ended up making the M90 without FN supervision, a bit of a simplified version. Hungary, FEG, would make several different versions. Arcus in Bulgaria, I've owned those before, made a almost exact copy as the 94, and kind of a copy of the BDA, the double action version, is the Arcus 98. This also had an extended 15-round mag and kind of Packmeyer style grips. Kind of one of the first to try to modernize it because that was their military gun. There have been several Turkish copies, Israeli copies. It just goes to show you how much people wanted it. So when FN announced it was discontinuing in 2018, several companies really ramped up their focus on high powers. We had 2 or 3 different types coming out of Turkey. I don't believe FEG was still making them. I'm surprised Arcus hasn't stepped in again. They used to make some actually quite nice pistols. And most famously in 2021, Springfield announced the SA-35. Interesting. I should point out that the final high powers that FN released prior to 2018 for the last few years were actually built under license in Portugal for FN because of rising labor costs in Belgium. Just part of the modern times, and that's part of this too. This is a old school gun, as you would imagine, something designed in the 1920s and 30s. Even if you try to introduce modern technologies, there's only so much you can do. So everyone got excited about the Springfield, and of course in 2022 FN has announced they're bringing the high power back per popular demand. And again, they're doing an updated version. I don't know, we should call it a Mark IV maybe, with newer features. And these are going to be built in the USA at FN's USA plant. I think it's the one in South Carolina, or is it North Carolina? I haven't had dinner yet. What can you do? So these will be American-made ones, not Belgium. And they're just now hitting the market, along with the Springfields, and we still can get the Turkish guns. So why? What is the big draw here, and is it really worth it? Well, it's hard for me to say objectively, but I can give my 2 cents. High power with extended mag. Did it a lot better than I expected for an extended mag. First off, if people are still manufacturing, purchasing, and using the 1911, there's absolutely no reason they shouldn't be with the high power. But it's certainly not cutting edge technology, cutting edge anything. It is classic old world design. And that's not a knock against it. For me personally, I like the history. Hence these. And I do like that this one has some improvements, namely the extractor. I really like the external extractor. I think that is almost a must. And the fact that it can fire hollow points, at least later versions like the Mark II can. But I'm not sure it's quite current. While I would happily shoot one, I would hesitate to say it's going to be competitive with truly new designs, but that's okay. Not everything has to be the newest and best ever. And while these aren't known for the best accuracy ever, like say the SIG P210, they're perfectly adequate. I've always liked the curve of the grip, the ergonomics. Some people don't like the grip panels. I do. Then again, I kind of like weird slab side grips, or the modern ones, whatever you want to do. Of course, the newer guns are getting rid of the magazine disconnect safety. It's not really all that important now that we have firing pin blocks in the newer guns anyway, so yeah. But there is, of course, a lot of nostalgia. The funny thing is, and the most enduring feature, is what Browning himself came up with many years ago, 100 years ago really, this magazine design. The current mags for the new guns are made by Metgar, and this type of tube is almost used by every modern double action, high capacity gun that uses a metal magazine. If you go to polymer, you might have something like a Glock. But if your gun uses a metal magazine tube, it probably resembles this with the dimples and the step and the way the follower works and this assembly. This has really endured the magazine, which makes sense because that's at the heart of the gun. The simplified Browning tipping barrel system with the linkless design has endured as well, although today, originally the barrel would actually lock using grooves into the slide. Today, the ejection port tends to lock directly into the slide, so we've actually further simplified it even from that. And usually today, takedown is even easier. You don't have to push out a pin, slide everything out. So the system certainly inspired more modern guns. And some, like the CZ75, still pretty much use this style. But others have progressed it even further, kind of like the Glock. But there has certainly been a lot of interest in it lately, which is good. It's nice to pay tribute to what's come before. And if you get one of the new Springfields or FNs, you'll get a great gun. Just don't expect it to be absolute cutting-edge tech in terms of accuracy and ergonomics, and it's going to be a little bit heavy. 1 kilogram was lightweight in the 1930s. It's not really what we consider lightweight today, is it? So will I be getting one of the Springfields or new FNs? No, I will not. I have no need for it. If someone loans me one, happy to take it out shooting. In fact, I need to take one of mine out shooting soon. Just haven't had it out in a long time. But the reason for me is a little different. I picked mine up when you could still get surplus guns. These were all bought surplus for quite cheap. The copies and clones were $200, and even the licensed guns like this one were $300 or $400, and even the World War II era guns. The Inglis's were actually a really good deal for a long time. The Nazi-produced ones were always a little spendy, if I'm being honest with you. But you could pick up an Inglis quite affordably for a long time. But I do understand that the surplus guns, even like the Israeli surplus police guns, are now gone. Now those were a good deal. The Israeli guns, they were available just a couple of years ago, and that was a good way to get a high power with some neat history behind it. But with surplus guns disappearing, it's not bad to have quality reproductions, modern production versions. We see this with the 1911. How many Springfield GI 1911s have you seen, or other GIs like the Auto Ordnance? It's kind of the natural progression once the surplus guns do dry up. So, great. I don't need one, but I completely understand for those who didn't get a chance at the surplus. Why not? I mean, if you want a shooter, a range gun, why would you pay $700-800 for a used gun of an unknown mechanical quality and history when you can buy a brand new gun from Springfield with a warranty? Or if you must have an FN branded gun for even more money, you can do that too. At least you know you will have something dependable and reliable. It's your call. But this seemed like something worth talking about as we get into the end of April 2022. So what is everyone else's impressions? What do you think about the changes on the Springfield or the FNs? Which pattern do you kind of like more? Or heck, maybe you're perfectly happy with the Turkish or Israeli or Hungarian or Bulgarian or yada 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 made clone copy. Some of them are very, very good, high quality, even parts interchangeable. Also, for the older guns, I'm kind of curious, which ones do you find more interesting, the Inglis or the FN Nazi occupation production versions? I have to admit, I kind of like the Inglis. I think the story behind them is pretty darn neat. Plus, they were more widespread issue. But that's just me. Anyway, I appreciate you hanging out with me. People seem to like the FAL G3 video, so I thought we would do this one today. Please do feel free to comment below. And if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd really like to help, check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha, and now I'm going to go have dinner. Catch you very soon next time.